様か。俺の仲間をやったのはこんなガキひねり潰してやる。貴様の拳など顔ほどにも効かんわい。
お前はもう死んでいる。
何？
Hello lovelies, today we're going to take a look at Exalted, but it's not really a review and it's not really a know your role, though I'll probably call it that. This is the second edition. There is a third edition and there was a first edition. But yeah, this isn't a review, this is a ramble, because Exalted for me is incredibly frustrating as a game. One of my biggest disappointments in the role-playing world. You know, White Wolf, who had revolutionized tabletop gaming with their storyteller system, with Vampire. You know, there was stuff leading up to it, sure, and it wasn't that revolutionary looking back because it was mostly in terms of presentation, but still, at the time, White Wolf and their storyteller system, these were things that were pretty goddamn exciting. And Vampire devoured at least 10 years of my life with the LARP Society and the tabletop and keeping up with everything and yeah, meeting Mrs. Grimm and all kinds of other stuff. So I owe the storyteller system and White Wolf a great deal, all things considered. But in many areas of my life they were also a source of frustration. Bad players, the interference in the LARP Society, the low esteem in which they kept many of their fans, which always struck me as a bit churlish. But still. So when White Wolf announced that they were going to get into fantasy gaming in a more direct way than they perhaps otherwise had, I was incredibly excited, because could they bring that same revolutionary spirit and interest to a fantasy game? And then more and more information began to come out about it. It was inspired by Indian and Chinese mythology, by anime and manga, and the wacky world of imaginary prehistory, which has become more popular more recently as well, and unfortunately distorted the revised mage in its own way. But still, as an imaginary world, you know, a time before the Great Catastrophe, when there was civilization and magic and all of that's been erased by history, that's kind of faded away into the background now. But at the time, that was the pushing point, and that was really exciting and interesting. So, you know, here was this company that had done revolutionary, brilliant things, had revitalized and reinvigorated a rather moribund tabletop RPG community. The storyteller system was easy, graspable, easy to teach people. Add these pips and these pips, roll them, you know, bosh, sorted. That was all great. And could they pull it off? So when it came out, I bought the first couple of books of the first edition to try and understand them, and reading the books was a fun experience. I've always enjoyed reading the Exalted books and getting into the background and the ideas and everything. That's always been hugely satisfying, and the artwork used to be better. I think the earlier editions had the much better artwork, but your mileage may vary. So it was always an enjoyable read, and it seemed like a really cool, interesting world with all kinds of different elements. A glorious mishmash, a sort of fantasy rifts, almost, in a lot of ways. And they were keeping the storyteller system, so it all looked fairly simple and easy to understand. You were basically a normal storyteller character, but you just had these weird superpowers and things on top that could let you do all kinds of cool anime shit, right? So that was there to be enjoyed. Characters had a tragic origin, they were reincarnated, there was an oppressive empire with its own oppressive culture, all led by the very forces that had usurped and killed us. All the bastards. We were going to get revenge. You know, there was a vicious Inquisitor pogrom going around trying to kill us every time we reincarnated. There were petty gods, strange creatures, the mysterious other exalted beings, such as the Lunars or the Abyssals. Fantastic. Brilliant. Right? Really interested. Okay, so it was power fantasy. But, you know, that can work. Playing powerful characters doesn't necessarily mean every adventure, every fight, everything has to be some sort of pushover. And looking towards games mastering the thing, I was thinking, well, you know, you can face off against whole armies, and that's kind of exciting, and they do stand a chance of wearing you down, or there could be gigantic monsters that you have to slay, or other powers, you know, the other Exalted, and units of the dragon-blooded Exalted that could come after you with their armies, you know, and survive long enough to be proper villains and all the rest of it. After all, they have the resources of an empire and some small measure of your power, while you are alone and isolated, and, you know, it all seemed like it could be interesting. So, yeah, super excited. Everyone made characters, and then we sat down to play the bloody thing. And playing Exalted is not at all ever what you were promised. It was not lean, it was not quick. You did not feel like a flashy, superpowered Exalted pulling off amazing moves and doing stuff, because for all that there was a simple rule system at the heart of it, everything piled on top of that simple rule system slowed everything down so dramatically that what should have been a flashy anime fight with explosions and chi powers going off turned into a feeling like you were wading through thick porridge. And so it was a huge, huge disappointment. Should have probably picked up on that when reading the books, but was possibly so caught up in enthusiasm for the whole thing that wasn't the case. So yeah, a huge disappointment. Now this happens with a lot of simple systems, because while the core system is simple, in order to make the game fully satisfying and to have it do all of the things that you need it to do, and to have those things interact with one another, you have to start piling rules upon rules upon rules upon rules, and sub-rulings, and so on. Alright, so you had your basic dice pool system, grab a bunch of d10s, roll them, figure out if you succeeded or not. But on top of that, there were all these powers, all these individual powers that both the Solar Exalted that you were playing and all the other Exalted had. And these all had different names and different descriptions, and they interacted with each other in different ways, and that often wasn't necessarily explicated by the rules themselves. Right. So it ended up a bit like playing early versions of Magic the Gathering, where every new card on the table required a new interpretation of the rules and a reinterpretation of how everything else was working at the time. So every time that happened, everything ground to a halt while you looked up the powers, what they said, how they might interact, whether there were any explicit rulings or not, and then the games master had to make a ruling and remember that ruling for the future, because people were then planning their tactics and so on based on how the powers had previously interacted, without that necessarily being how things are going to help at this point. So, like a lot of simple games, it just completely got out of hand in the actual play of the thing. Because all of these cool powers became a millstone around the game's neck, making it hugely complicated and difficult to do anything with the game, particularly combat. Combat was interminable. Everything outside combat was kind of okay, but combat itself was such a huge pain in the ass that the few times we did play it, we kind of deliberately avoided combat, even though the majority of gifts and powers and things are to do with maneuvers and invulnerability and that sort of thing. At least the flashy, most interesting ones. And of course, you want to keep your characters survivable, and you want action. It's just every time we got into action, it took forever. Previously, I've referenced a game where you make up the rules as you go along, and people thought I meant Calvin Ball, which I didn't, but you're welcome to invoke Calvin Ball if you wish. I was being more pretentious and was trying to reference a game called Gnomic, which is a game created in 1982 by a philosopher, Peter Suber. And in Gnomic, what you do is, as you go along, you vote on new rules to bring into the game, and you can challenge rules, and challenging rules is a valid part of the game turn process. So that's what I was referencing. And certainly with all the powers and everything in each book piling up on top of each other, playing Exalted and making and remembering rulings to deal with clashes in the rules became very much like a game of Gnomic. And of course, you may have made different rulings with different groups or different people at different times, and yeah, keeping track of all that and being fair and balanced as a games master, nightmarish. So the second edition came along and promised to kind of rationalize it and make it more playable, but ended up just really being a tidying up exercise, bringing everything together, where the first edition had kind of sprawled enthusiastically like first editions of most games do. The second edition should have rationalized things and made it easier to make and track rulings, and should have come up with solutions to most of the more common problems, and in fairness it probably did to an extent, but just not enough. Now's the third edition. As I said, this is the second edition. The third edition, and I've only had a quick leaf through that and not read it in depth, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't really seem any better than the second edition, and not much better than the first edition. Furthermore, mystifyingly, the third edition has largely abandoned the anime and manga aesthetic that really sold first edition and was still present in second edition, and is relegated to a few pieces here and there in the third edition, and not the cover, which is where you would think that the anime and manga branding to appeal to Gen Z or whoever would be. You would think that would be where it would be most important to have the anime branding, but no. This is a weird decision to me. In an environment where anime and manga has never been more popular, where translations of Japanese games are finally making it to the West and are proving quite popular and raising sufficient money on Kickstarter and similar places, where Avatar made a bajillion gold pieces on Patreon, it's just bizarre to me that a new edition of Exalted wouldn't lean even more heavily into the anime and manga influence. But they didn't. And it's still not much more playable, if more playable at all. You've got other options these days as well, of course. You have some Japanese RPGs that tap into the same thing. You've got some weeb games that tap into similar sorts of ideas, or come at them from a very different angle entirely. Fate, if you convert Exalted to Fate, works really well. A lot of people did that, going all the way back to the first edition, I think. Godbound by Kevin Crawford is an OSR type game that brings in godlike powers easily enough. The godlike powers in Godbound are, if anything, slightly more powerful than those in Exalted, but you could easily enough come up with new power words connected to each skill or whatever to use with Godbound. That would work pretty well. In many ways, ironically enough, Scion, also originally by White Wolf, is arguably a better, more rational game than Exalted is, for doing similar sorts of things, because in Scion you're playing the demigod children of other pantheons that have been displaced by the Christian God in various ways. And so you have fairly minor god powers, but that one works a hell of a lot better than I think Exalted does. So you might even find a way to tone down a lot of the powers from Exalted and turn them into more Scion-like powers, which would work a hell of a lot better if you ask me. The trouble with Scion is that its presentation, etc., has always been mysteriously dull, given the exuberance of the possibilities of the setting, whereas Exalted has tended to, but decreasingly, has celebrated its over-the-topness. Scion has always been a little bit more sheepish about it, maybe once bitten, twice shy, because of the problems with Exalted. And it lacks... Scion is mysteriously dull in both presentation and content, and it lacks a truly satisfying hook, which is weird when you consider the existence of American gods and all of that kind of stuff of fiction, if we're allowed to mention Neil Gaiman again yet. But still. But yeah, Exalted, one of the biggest prick teasers of a game I've ever owned. If I do ever end up running it again, probably a conversion to something else, maybe even Feng Shui. That would work very well given the stunt mechanics and so on. I'm not going to give it a score because this isn't a review, and there's so much that I like, even love, about Exalted. It just doesn't translate to the table when you sit down to play. You know, you want to play this kind of energetic whiz-bang chi powers going off left, right and centre, quick, fast, keep that sense of pace and hecticity to everything, and it just doesn't happen. It is like wading through porridge, and the game keeps getting in its own way. Zang.
Postmortem Studios, role-playing games, and a lot more to die for. Post-mort.com